Welcome to our final panel of the exciting symposium on reading modes today. This panel is going to be on technological encounters, AI, techno-feudalism, and machine learning. It's going to put pressure, hopefully, on the possibilities and costs of machine reading. And this will be the final panel, but also the longest one. So it's going to be 2 hours long. We have 4 speakers, but they each are going to speak for 20 minutes. I'm going to be the castrating father, as in Emma Lieber's terms, and I'm going to be with a little sign when the 20 minutes are over so that we all have time for discussion in the end. We have 4 speakers: David Bates from the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley; Matt Ziebold, who came to us from the Department of English at Elmira College; Nina Bagush from the Center of Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society here at UC Berkeley. And to end the conversation will be Hannes Bayor from the Department of Germany and of German. Here we go. At the University of California, Berkeley. This is why I'm not an AI. Will be a very bad one. David.
What's up? Great, thank you so much. This has been great so far and glad to be a part of it. The 20 minutes might be a problem, so definitely you can cut off my mic if it's an issue. So I want to start really with a basic kind of principle, which is that humans are defined by their exteriorization of memory. As Bernard Stiegler argues, it's technical from the very beginning. It first takes shape as a stone tool millions of years ago, and then transforms itself into ideogrammatic writing and then the alphabet. So this is to put the history of reading and writing into a longer history of the technical being. This is something that Walter Ong famously talked about in his book on the technologization of the word. He says, as we know, that reading and writing are not natural. Thought processes do not grow out of simply natural powers, but out of these powers are structured directly or indirectly by the technology of writing. So this has been confirmed by many recent cognitive scientists, most notably Marianne Wolf and Stanislav Dehaene in France, that not only is reading not natural, but reading and writing in different languages uses different parts of the brain. So the important thing there is that because intelligence is reflexive, as Ong says here, the tools that we use, including writing, become internalized, part of our own reflexive process. So there's no human using the tool constitutes the human. And that would be true of, if you know Walter Ong's argument, how important writing is for enabling certain kinds of linear thinking, rationality, the nation state. It goes on and on. So I'll start I don't know if it's an argument or a story, but we'll start with Plato's critique of writing in the Phaedrus. Here he has the god of writing coming to the king of the deities to offer his gift, which is his discovery that provides a recipe for memory and wisdom, which is writing. So the king's response is, according to Socrates, as for wisdom, you're equipping your pupils only with a semblance of it, not with truth. And thanks to you and your invention of writing, your pupils will be widely read without benefit of a teacher's instruction, because the books do not actually dialogue with you. So they will be incapable of real judgment. So this is what Walter Ong says. Plato's Socrates also holds it against writing that the written word cannot defend itself as the natural spoken word can. Speech and thought always exist essentially in a context of give and take. Writing is passive out of it in an unreal, unnatural world. And he links it with the world that we're in now, and this is 1980s, the computer. So what I'd like to mention, though, of course, is that this is a kind of very bald kind of division between the orality and literacy. And we can look with Derrida and his famous essay, Plato's Pharmacy, that what Plato's attacking is this substitution of a mnemonic device, a technology for live memory, of the prosthesis for the organ, this perversion that consists of replacing a limb by a thing, here substituting the passive mechanical by heart for the active reanimation of knowledge, for its reproduction in the present. So memory, though, and this is where Derrida goes on to kind of deconstruct this idea, memory also therefore already needs signs in order to recall the non-present. And that's true in the oral language as well as in writing, of course, with which it is necessarily in relation. The movement of dialectics bears witness to this. Memory is thus always contaminated by its first substitute, which is hypomnesis. But what Plato dreams of is a memory with no sign, that is, with no supplement. So he dreams of this possibility of a pure memory, but it's impossible, even in language, not to have these signs that stand in for the present. So this is actually enacted in the dialogue where Derrida notes that Socrates says in the dialogue, "You seem to have discovered a drug for getting me out in the town. A hungry animal can be driven by dangling a carrot or a bit of green stuff in front of it. Similarly, if you proffer me speeches bound in books, I don't doubt you can cart me all around Attica and anywhere else you please." So the question isn't so much of writing, but as Socrates says, there remains the question of the propriety and impropriety of writing. That is to say, the conditions which make it proper or improper. Isn't that so? So the question is, what is writing as a technology in that context of knowledge? So I'll skip to Kant, who, referring back to Plato, says that one of the ancients said, and this is in the Phaedrus, the art of writing has ruined memory, to some extent made it dispensable. So Kant agrees there's some truth in this, because you kind of mechanically read instead of animating thought in a proper way. Memory here is mechanical and no subtle reasoning interferes with it. But Kant, of course, was a writer. Here's an example of his writing if you want to try and read it. And he says, on the other hand, the scholar who has many strange ideas running through his head lets many of his tasks or domestic affairs escape through distraction because he has not grasped them with sufficient attention. So he says that we need to be, as he says here, safe with a notebook in the pocket. It's a great convenience to recover precisely and without effort everything that has been stored in the head. And the art of writing always remains a magnificent one, because even when it is not used for the communication of one's knowledge to others, it still takes the place of the most extensive and reliable memory and can compensate for its lack. So you see there in Kant the enactment of this internalization of an exteriorized way of thinking. So this is why Kant is actually a fan of reading. This can inspire us with wonder over our own being. For a higher being need only call, "Let there be light," and then without the slightest cooperation on our part, for instance, when we take an author with all that he has in his memory, as it were, set half a world before his eyes. So reading can bring something that we have not experienced into our own experience. So what is a book then? For Kant, it's interesting. He says the book as a writing is when an author is speaking to the reader. The one who prints the book speaks by his copy, not for himself, but simply and solely in the author's name. He presents the author as speaking publicly and only mediates delivery of his speech to the public. So this is to say, to go back to the Phaedrus, the writing is actually not just a technology of memory, it's also a medium of expression. In a modern society, a print society, to speak publicly is to speak through the book. So Kant has a very important essay here on the rights and wrongs of publications of books. So if we look to the more modern period and to think about what is a book in the way that we've been asking in the conference, then the next phase is to think about what it means to have books in the computer age. And this is a very historically specific time. And I'll turn to the philosopher Karl Popper for an interesting thought experiment. He says, a book remains a book even if it is never read, as may easily happen nowadays. There's lots of jokes you can make there about academia, obviously, but more important, I think, is he says a book or even a library need not even have been written by anybody. A series of books of logarithms, for example, may be produced and printed by a computer. This is a callback to Charles Babbage, I think. It may be the best and fullest series of books of logarithms. It may contain logarithms up to, say, 50 decimals. It may be sent out to libraries, but it may be found too cumbersome for use. At any rate, years may lapse before anyone uses it. and many figures in it may never be looked at as long as men live on Earth. Yet each of these figures contains what I call objective knowledge. And I think what we're looking at there through Popper is the idea that knowledge isn't defined by its human animation, but actually by its relationship to a technical medium. So that leads me nicely and quickly into later in the 20th century, which is Kittler. And his important argument in this text that media are becoming, in some ways, dissolved in favor of a single medium. In the old days, he says, whatever ran as time on a physical or real level, blindly and unpredictably, could by no means be encoded. Therefore, all data flows, provided they really were streams of data, had to pass through the bottleneck of the signifier, alphabetic monopoly, grammatology. So that's the world of the book that's changing. Now he says, data flows once confined to books and later to records and films are disappearing into black holes and boxes that, as artificial intelligences, are bidding us farewell on their way to nameless high commands. So here you get the sense that Kittler is also describing this autonomy of knowledge, that the data flows are conducting their own business with artificial intelligence and bidding the human farewell, as he famously will argue. So if we're thinking about writing then and reading, he says, for mechanized writing to be optimized, one can no longer dream of writing as the expression of individuals or the trace of bodies. That's not just a theory, but a kind of demonstration that he wants to make in this book. The very forms, differences, and frequencies of its letters have to be reduced to formulas. So-called man is split up into physiology and information technology. So this is important because Kittler wants to make the argument, especially at the last part of the book, the typewriter, about the technical media and its relationship to the autonomy, you might say, of symbolic meaning. He says, for both people and computers are subject to the appeal of the signifier. That is, they are both run by programs. Are these humans, Nietzsche already asked himself 8 years before buying a typewriter, or perhaps only thinking, writing, and speaking machines? And that's really the gambit of the end of Kittler's book, is that we're entering an age where reading and writing is really a machine activity rather than a human activity. I'll just point to an interesting article that you might want to look at, Pierre Lévy's Artificial Reading. He talked about cyberspace in the 1990s, where again, hypertextual operations, which were really popular in the 1990s, act as a kind of exteriorization of the process of reading. So the text is really reading itself through its hyperlink structure. So as Kittler says, Turing hit upon the idea of a universal discrete machine. His early dreams were realized and transformed. He merely got rid of the people and typists that Remington and Son needed for reading and writing. So the computer becomes, again, this autonomous information processor that doesn't require the human as a link. A total media link on a digital base will erase the very concept of medium. Instead of wiring people and technologies, absolute knowledge will run on an endless loop. So there again, you say it's not so much about the constitutive relation between the human and its technical systems and its exteriorizations, but a writing out of people from the equation altogether. So when we think about how prescient Kittler was, the contemporary era is seen a drastic transformation, but more than a transformation, a kind of disruption of reading and writing in the 20th century. As Stigler says, an artifact is necessarily something that disturbs an equilibrium. And that's what Kittler was showing was already happening in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, we'd have to say this is absolutely true of the digital revolution. But Stigler is not an anti-technological thinker. What he wants to argue in relation back to Derrida and the pharmacy of Plato, that Derrida didn't think enough about the positive side of the pharmacon. And this is a problem for me, because in my view, the decisive question is how to transform a poison into a remedy. This is a question for everything, for all kinds of artifacts. So a new technology is necessarily disruptive, and it will disable certain forms of, for us, reading and writing, but maybe enable other forms of thinking and reading. So as he says, digital pharmaca are poured into society and the skills are distributed very unequally. This is to say that the technical innovation is not just a disruption of the technical, it's a disruption at the very level of the social and the economic, the cultural, the political. Okay, so to go back to the Phaedrus, Stigler wants to argue that, yes, exteriorization of memory is a loss of memory and of knowledge. It's experienced today in our daily lives, in all the aspects of our existence, and more often in the feeling of our powerlessness, if not of our impotence. This is the exact moment when the extraordinary mnesic power of digital networks makes us all the more sensible to the immensity of human memory, which seems to have become infinitely reactivable and accessible. So Stigler is still putting pressure on the idea of the human, but unlike Kittler, believes that there still is the possibility of this wiring together, let's say, of our technologies and our own minds in order to do something productive, so that the digital is going to be destructive, but also potentially productive. So reading in particular for Stigler becomes an important locus for thinking about the digital in the age of artificial intelligence and digital infrastructures. Reading, he says, is just an education of our attention span, the way we perceive the world. We should, however, remember that reading used to be considered dangerous and toxic. So we can look back to the 18th century and other periods of time when it was considered to be a bad thing to read too much and live in the realm of the imagination and not the real world. But what Stigler's really paying attention to here with his theory of attention is that it needs to be trained. And depending on the regime of training, whether it's medieval academic culture or the Sumerians or today in the 21st century, technology is what trains our attention. As he says, the literal reader is herself an apparatus. She is equipped. She accesses on her own the content of a literal recording, providing, and this is the important point, she has spent the requisite number of years enabling her to instrumentalize, automatize, and mechanize the functioning of her memory, having transformed herself by and for herself into an instrument of reading. So this is very similar to Kittler's argument, but Stigler is still saying that there is a human element here, which is to say the individuation of that event of reading in a live psychic body. So we still have to take into account then the relationship of what we might call the inhuman of technology and the human of a psychic being. As he says, what is the digital if not a form of writing? And this is where the danger comes. This is the pharmacon as danger. The digital is writing that can be inscribed and read by automata, scanned, as one says, at close to the speed of light. It is an essentially automatic writing and reading. The reason this is important for Stigler is that our digital pharmaca operate at speeds greater than the nervous system, whereas older media were in some ways tied to the actual rhythms of our own temporality. And this is where we can become lost, literally, in our digital world. The second thing that Stigler wants to pay attention to is that training of our attention is not simply a neutral operation, but one that is taken over by the realm of capital and what he calls the industrialization of memory. He says, if the continuous flow of information can impulse an actual consumerism of memory, the reason lies as much in the delegation of reading and writing skills to machines as to a becoming commodity of memory. The latter would be impossible without the former. This is the organization of the loss of knowledge by industrial hypomnesis, from which all opportunity for anamnesis, a more pure relationship to memory, appears absent. So this is the danger that we face in the 21st century, is not so much the elimination of reading and writing, but the complete exteriorization of reading and writing to the machine, so that the human has no effect on that digital infrastructure. We are all overwhelmed, he says, by the sheer quantity of digital pharmaca. This is why the whole planet is intoxicated, not in a good way. Men and women, animals, plants, everything. We really have to be absolutely clear about this. We are going through a crisis of mass intoxication. So the question then in the 21st century, as Marianne Wolf has recently argued, is to think about the reading brain in a digital world. What is actually happening to our brains? We need to know that before we can re-establish something like a reading practice in the digital era. As Stigler wrote, the fact that the digital overwrites itself into organic brain tissue, just as did alphabetic writing, the brain is literally written by these technologies. Even if the automation of this new form of writing that writes and reads at near light speed radically modifies social organology most often by short-circuiting or bypassing it. So the brain is being trained to be a component of the system rather than part of a social organization. And that's what's being attacked in the digital era. So what's the point there? I'll just end, I think, on time with this quote from Stigler, which is to say, when you are capable of transforming a poison into a remedy, it is because you have developed a knowledge of this pharmacon. So that's a plea for what Stigler called digital studies. So not a romantic retreat to older forms of thinking and reading and writing, but a knowledge of what is actually happening to our brains in the digital era so that some new kinds of processes and operations may be enabled. Thank you.
I am going to forego the tyranny of the visual, having the preference, obviously, for the completely unproblematic medium of the podcast, and read to you something from a work in progress, very small selection. So I will give a very short preamble that is a kind of political, economic history of education technology, through which I am trying to triangulate the impact of a relatively small set of heavily government subsidized universities, what Veblen imagined as a kind of engineering Soviet, which I place in Silicon Valley, and a kind of changing gravitational center of finance as a penumbra of asset managers, particularly private equity. The Fun They Had, a sketch by Isaac Asimov, begins with two adolescent children, 200 years in the future, leaning over a book about primary school education, which one of them is fished out of an addict. The entire sketch is dedicated to describing the dual shock felt most intensely by the younger protagonist, Margie, at their first encounter with what they describe as a real book. They are shocked first by the book's materiality, its portability, its fragility, its textures, its smell, and then again by its content, quotidian descriptions of a typical elementary school in mid-century America. Margie's captivation by the book's account of school is contrasted with her attested hatred of her own school. Education in the future, as Asimov imagines it, is a succession of tests delivered and assessed in the home by a mechanical teacher, which Margie describes as large and black and ugly with a big screen on it where all the lessons are shown and the questions are asked. Margie lives in fear of her family's teacher, especially the moments when she has to feed it her homework, expressed in a punch code they made her learn when she was 6 years old. The homework is graded instantaneously and without regard for her efforts or her feelings. During the first half of Asimov's sketch, Margie and Tommy are absorbed in a process of collaborative reading. Leaning together over the book, they excitedly point out passages to one another and try to deduce from them something about the unfamiliar world to which it gives them a glimpse. They are novice close readers in a way, and they are loving it. When the scene shifts after Margie is called into school by her mother, the tone shifts as well. Her existing dissatisfaction with the school of her own time is heightened by the introduction of knowledge of a past alternative. She wishes she could keep reading about those funny schools they had when her grandfather's grandfather was a little boy. A wish by which Asimov creates a dual longing, both for this historical imaginary, but also for the brief taste of its praxis she had just experienced by leaning close to Tommy over the book. Margie now ignores the mechanical teacher's various beeps and flashes designed to sustain her undivided attention, and instead fantasizes about how the kids must have loved school in the old days. She envies the fun they had. If Asimov's mildly dystopian vision of school in the 22nd century reminds you eerily of the ascendant for-profit Alpha School, recently exhaustively profiled in the New York Times, and then equally exhaustively excoriated in Wired magazine, that is no mere coincidence. The Alpha School is founded upon the theories which Asimov was satirizing, theories which I contend are the inception of today's education technology industry, which has, by some accounts, as much as $500 billion in annual revenue. Despite serious misgivings as to whether it has delivered any value for its clients, institutional partners, or students. One recent study concluded that there is almost nothing schools spend money on that does less for student outcomes than buying education technology. The researchers recommended that any school considering buying laptops for all its students upgrade the HVAC system instead. The fun they had was published 3 times in quick succession during the mid-1950s. Lastly, in Asimov's auspiciously titled 1957 collection, Earth is Room Enough. The author was trying to put it in front of as many readers as possible during a period when a collective of American behavioral technologists, most notably among them B.F. Skinner, were campaigning for education reforms based on teaching machines, or as they sometimes preferred to call them, automated teachers. Skinner got involved in education reform after visiting the elite Shady Hill School, founded by Harvard professors for the children of Harvard professors, for a Bring Your Daddy to Work, or Bring Your Daddy to School Father's Day event. Skinner was dispirited to find that the pedagogical practices of his daughter's school, though they closely resembled those he remembered fondly from his own childhood, did not adhere to 2 core principles of the reinforcement theory of learning then being developed by behaviorists. These principles were self-pacing, the ability of the subject to advance the learning process whenever they were ready, and immediate feedback, the rapidest possible assessment of learning, such that subjects would still remember exactly what they had done when they were told whether it was right or wrong. Self-pacing and immediate feedback are still core principles, design aspirations, and marketing terms for the edtech industry. This is more of a footnote, but I think it's an important one. At the time Skinner decided U.S. schools needed to adapt the reinforcement theory of learning, the sole subjects from which that theory's core principles had been empirically derived were rats. Historians of the behaviorist movement frequently refer to Skinner and his generation as gadgeteers or tinkerers, because a common side effect of their research methods was a need to design and build devices for their laboratories. They sometimes imagined getting rich off of these inventions. And in a few cases, including Skinner's, behaviorists were businessmen first who had made a mid-career pivot into academic psychology, but then seemed to be using the resources of their university to fund patent projects to enrich themselves. And this sometimes worked. The Skinner box, for instance, became a standard purchase for companies making pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, food additives, and other heavily regulated chemical products. The Skinner box, of course, was a customized cage for rats. Skinner designed a second box-shaped commercial good in the 1940s, which he imagined would find a much larger market beyond the lab. It was an incubator customized for safety and comfort and marketed to mothers of infants who were struggling to find enough time to cook and clean. Skinner's Air Crib attained notoriety after it was featured in Ladies' Home Journal, though not the kind of notoriety that translates into sales. When Skinner's prototyped his first box-shaped teaching machine then, it is not especially surprising that neither the Shady Hill School nor any other Cambridge school was eager to be the testing ground for the inventor of the Air Crib, which had come to be known more colloquially as baby in a box, and was a comic avatar for bad parenting during the baby boom era. The teaching machines invented by Skinner and his behaviorist peers in the 1950s, though they stirred a fair amount of media interest, never caught on with schools. And this iteration of the EdTech movement petered out by the end of the decade, though not before. At a conference in 1959, two behaviorists proposed that personal computers, though still decades from mass production, would be the technology by which all the aspirations of the teaching machines movement could be realized. Well, I'm not sure we can credit Noam Chomsky with killing mid-century teaching machines. It certainly did not help them that starting in 1959, he wrote a series of searing denunciations of Skinner, who had been the public face of the movement since 1954. The denunciations didn't even mention Skinner's proposals for education, but the accusations Chomsky made about behavioral technologism as a body of thought were easily enough adopted into a critique of the teaching machines movement. I don't want to spend too much time on Chomsky's Skinner essays, which are certainly worthy of a paper unto themselves. But at the core of Chomsky's argument is that as a school of thought, behavioral technologism is a vacuous pseudoscience that appropriates a disciplinary vocabulary from the laboratory to give a veneer of scientific legitimacy to a reactionary account of human nature. Chomsky alleges that if the behavioral technologists are not themselves fascists, they are useful idiots working on behalf of fascism. And he shows how the operational structure of concentration camps would qualify as a Skinnerian utopia, concluding that the only impactful things behavioral technologism has given society are ideas for tools which facilitate totalitarian control and a rhetoric for rationalizing the diffusion of such tools. It was very apparent from the outset that the teaching machines movement was hostile to educational labor, at least in childhood and secondary education, to the infrastructure of public education at large, to feminism, and to humanism. This is all part of the satirical critique of teaching machines embedded in Asimov's sketch, and with the exception of the anti-feminism, all directly addressed by Chomsky as well. But something that both Asimov and Chomsky intuited about the teaching machines movement, which was less overt, was its hostility to reading, at least as it was conventionally taught and practiced in mid-century United States schools. Many of the behavioral technologists were eager to decenter the book as a foundational teaching technology, or at least to reconstruct the book as something that would be more conducive to the value they placed on reinforcement, that's to put it generously, or to put it less generously, to reconstruct the book as a mechanism of social control, access to which needed to be rationed. As Skinnerians saw it, in order to get access to literature and literacy, you had to be willing to give something up, to submit your reading practice to a regime of perpetual supervision, feedback, and potentially behavioral modification. The ecstasy Margie experiences when browsing a real book with Tommy is the freedom of reading outside this kind of regime for the first time in her life. When Asimov imagines the post-print computerized literacy of the mid-22nd century, he was still very much living in an analog society. But now I can't help wondering whether we might get to his dystopia a century ahead of schedule. Last year, I wrote an essay on what I call the techno-feudal text, which I define as a piece of writing which exists as digital information stored in a networked cloud architecture and therefore has a kind of magnetic, even parasitical relationship to its readers, where information about them is affixed to it, accruing value independent of whether or how much they pay to access it. To describe this identifying information, I prefer the term CAPTA, deturned from Deirdre McCloskey, to the more common data. Because, and hopefully our classicist will correct me if I've been misled here, there is a philological difference between things given and things seized. To engage with any kind of digitized text, whether you have purchased it with money or not, is to simultaneously submit rent or vassalage in the form of CAPTA. Increasingly granular surveillance metrics of how one engages with that text, tagged to markers of identification which allow, potentially, for aggregation of the CAPTA seized by one techno-feudal fiefdom with CAPTA seized by others. The kinds of techno-feudal texts I was thinking about through McCloskey were Kindle books. But while ebooks fulfill one part of the fantasy of behavioral technology, the surveillance part, the ability to track and collect the behavioral residues for each individual reader in real time, they still fail to create the mechanism of perpetual feedback, of reinforcement, which Margie fears from her mechanical teacher. This is where generative AI and its confluence of large language model corpuses, deep neural networks, and dynamic interfaces comes in. The heavily promoted education divisions at OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and Anthropic have created the best realization yet of Skinner's fantasy of reading under a regime of perpetual reinforcement. The techno-feudal reader not only has their perception of texts constantly surveilled, recorded, and aggregated, but has their access to reading conditioned on a quality of their engagement. Rather than assign students a Platonic dialogue in its entirety and risk having them read it selectively, incompletely, interestedly, or not at all, administrators at, say, Texas A&M and their private partners could train their Socratic agentic model to determine which parts of the dialogue are available and how they are assembled, abridged, and annotated, based not only on how students proceed through previous portions of the text and how they prompt the model, but also on the repository of student CAPTA, which the university provides, and is integrated into the model before students even begin the course. I don't think it's particularly news at this point that generative AI platforms being developed by authoritarian sympathizing tech monoliths and purchased by college administrations who are fed up with student protests and educational labor organizing are being embraced by those constituents because of their perceived potential as tools for indoctrination and social control, whether or not they are actually functional to those ends, which I think is still an open question. But I hope in this paper to augment that hyper-visible trend in two ways. First, by showing that the hostility towards unsurveilled and uncoerced reading by students has a rather long history, and it will not disappear if this particular edtech bubble bursts. And second, by suggesting that we need to develop an unsentimental and democratic account inside literary studies of precisely why Margie prefers a real book and a special building where all the kids go, and why she longs for an experience she's never had of going to a school where the teachers are people. Thank you.
This is wonderful. I look forward to our discussion. Let's hope this works. It's going to connect, right? Okay. I don't have the internet, but it should work without one. So this project is a very interdisciplinary pursuit. It's kind of a scientific, artistic, humanistic collaboration. So I'll take about half of my talk to just guide you in. But let's break down my title first. So why novel audiences? The novel audiences in my talk are twofold. So they're humans trying to decode what the machines we invented are actually doing with our texts as novel audiences of the language we also originated. We're pretty much in the domain of interpretability with this presentation. We're penetrating into the inner workings of machines, both through interpretation of their exteriors and interiors. And my phrase novel audiences actually comes from Katie Garrow's thought-provoking essay that's coming out in our forthcoming volume, First Encounters with AI. Hannes is also part of it. And here Katie Garrow argues that literature has gained a new reader with LLMs. And this question, can machines read and how, rings as a contemporary version of Turing's provocation from 1950, can machines think? But reading is not mere information processing, right? It's ideational, it's hermeneutic, it's generative, it's transformative. And so Garrow argues that this relation between the writer and the reader is broken, with machines digesting literature as data. It's corrupt with the profit-driven model of mainstream LLMs. So she suggests a more public good, library-oriented development trajectory for language models, kind of the poison and remedy discourse here. And this idea that language models digest the entirety of the internet more than an individual or even a collective reader could it's compelling to many methods, really, within literary studies, to world literature, to distant reading, cultural analytics, and so on. We're just creating special issues on world literature and also cultural analytics with AI. So lots going on here. But what if we train a computational model just on a single literary work? Would this give us more information about that work, or maybe more information about how the AI model operates? So I wanted to stage this talk as a kind of intervention on how machines actually read, and maybe to go back to David's talk, maybe show some more positive production of what falls under the AI umbrella today. So academic and also public discourse around machines focuses largely on the outcomes of generative AI. Its inner workings are blurry. They are these inaccessible black boxes, right? We see results, we see no interior process. In an analogy to another non-public facing part of the Statue of Liberty that you are seeing in the photo. And we've just published this paper, Latent Spacecraft, with wonderful collaborators, Meta Haven, Gasper Begush, and Ricky Petrini. And so I wanted to bring into the humanities discussion other models than just language models, large language models. And I'll be talking also about generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which you might remember from about 10 years ago for images of fake cats. They were pretty much, and still are, a point of the discourse, mostly with the visual domain and with the arts. But these models are built in the artificial and biological language laboratory here in Berkeley. So they are an academic pursuit, an academic setting, exploring language in machines with, especially if you compare them to LLMs, little resources, very little data needed, just a few words of English to get this more noisy output. So it's really an entirely different process of, say, digesting the internet or human language and bringing it into the world via language, via speech. So why Finnegan's Wake? Joyce tests the limits of the novel with the limits of human language, right? He walks the line of the speakable in a novel that's really meant to be read aloud. And here's another mode of reading that unfortunately we can't discuss right now, but this photo of an authentic Ulysses location where Leopold Bloom bought his lemon soap and Molly's lotion, right? You can see them like they're very much like a choir. There's something about this embodied reading, as machine learning people would say. But let's think about language in computational settings, both in writing and in speaking. It's almost too glib, it's too ordered. It's this world of perfect Newtonian physics where an apple falls beautifully down from the tree. But there's more to AI in language, especially when you look through speech. We make in the paper, we make this analogy with the invention of AI and machine learning to the invention of flight, because, well, flight evolved in the biological world, right? We have insects and pterosaurs and birds that fly, and we have flying fish even. But once humans discovered underlying principles of flight, we could fly too in a variety of other forms. We've got planes, paragliders, helicopters, drones, balloons, and so on. So, Finnegan's Wake. It explores language in other registers. Joyce really gets to the task of inventing his own idiom to write this novel. And he's talking about the writing of the night, this dreamlike, sleeping attention to the language. He's capturing the non-narratable through language. He says, one great part of every human existence is passed in a state which cannot be rendered sensible by the use of wide-awake language. I want to express how things are at night in the different stages. And by mere coincidence, actually, another writer in our volume reflected on Finnegan's Wake in his essay, and he describes this as this masterpiece that taps into the language of the inner states. And we made a very similar argument in our paper as well, that Joyce pretty much takes this inner state of speech via text and channels it directly to the latent space of the reader, to the inner state of the reader, without ever really completely externalizing it, almost by bypassing explicit language. Finnegan's Wake overwhelms the reader, right? But it trains their attention. And here's what Yasmin Freilich writes. He says, the language of Finnegan's Wake is densely sampled, attempting to bridge language and meaning in a more organic way, but in discarding the social dimension of language, oblivious of Wittgenstein's Sprachspiel, it samples reality perhaps in a more perfect, yet to us less intelligible way. It's sampling the reality of language itself, not of reality through the medium of language. And going back to David's observation about attention, here I said Finnegan's Wake trains the reader in this attention. Is technology now training us in this attention? Because we see some underlying principles in Finnegan's Wake that some scholars have called language laws, which hold the text together. And they're not just abstract, as we argue in the paper, they're also held together in this physical way, because both in art and in science, like in physics, they claim some foundational abstractions that steer us away from the demand that we must stick to this plausibility that's linguistically cohesive, right? So we play with the Stigler's metaphor of the flying fish, leaving their milieu to experience a different one by abstraction, and show that a physical layer is required to do it, which is another argumentation that I don't have the space for today. I really just want to show you how the models look like. And I think starting with the excerpts might actually be the best way in. So in the first one, you have the novel, then you have the two models. A language model that's trained on a small GPT-2 on Finnegan's Wake text, and then again, a truly tiny GAN trained on Finnegan's Wake audio. And these are truly random examples. No selection was made. And you can see these words, for example, in the literary text in Finnegan's Wake, that are often nonsensical, right? But it's not completely disruptive. There's still something that maintains this cohesion. Just if we think about the novel's famous word, river run, right? And I used for the Finnegan LM, for the language model, I used Jukoleon, which is, Jukoleon is a word from Finnegan's Wake. I prompted the model with that one, and this is what you get. You can see the Finnegan LM model comes up with new coinages, kind of imitates the level of cohesion from the novel, but struggles with coherence, which Hannes can tell you a lot more about with his surface narration. I'll try to focus largely on the GAN model in this talk. So this model is just audio, and I'm going to give you, oh, can't load. Well, that's because I don't have the internet. Just a second, I'm going to get my phone. So this is the model, the GAN. And this is the transcription. I'm not sure if you've heard that. Let's listen to it again. So you can see the transcription is actually not quite accurate, right? It's more orderly. It struggles to make sense of what it detects in speech. There's no hole in holy and so on. It overcorrects. It's kind of, as a good computational model should, right? It's like an adult making sense of children's babble, as if the babble was an invalid way of doing language. But it's not. We've all gone through it. So you can see Finnegan LM kind of pushes the novel towards more entropy, and Finnegan goes even further into this latent space of its language, makes a step further towards noisiness, which is basically how GANs work. These are the vectors for the sentence that you've just heard. And this is the Finnegan, which we can try to listen again here. And it takes a long time because it guides you through the layers. It starts with complete noise. Oh, I actually muted it here. Well, let's unmute this one, which is already loaded. I'm sorry about this.
On solid. Did you really buy about 30 guy and lemons allowed just on solid? Did you really buy about 30 guy and lemons allowed just on solid? Did you really buy about 30 guy and lemons allowed just on solid? This is pretty much what you get at the very end of the output. So it's not really completely externalized speech. You kind of can't really hear the exact word, or maybe you can. You kind of have to figure it out what it's saying. It's I guess language at higher entropy. It's the inner layers before it actually before it's completely externalized. Now, how do GANs work? I really don't need you to know all this. I just need to tell you one particular interesting detail about how they are composed, and that is that they are the only deep learning architecture in which the part of the network that generates the output never sees the training data. So it literally starts from scratch. It has to learn just from the feedback of the other network. It doesn't know if it's producing an image or a sound or whatever it may be. Anything that's datafiable will work. It helped with decoding whale clicks, for example. But it's motivated, this inner network that is producing, it's motivated to produce because it tries to make sense to the other network. And so it needs to create, its goal is to create a deep fake, a fake data that's so similar to the real data that the other network can't tell a difference anymore. So it goes from complete noise to the data that is indistinguishable. And I guess the biggest difference between Finnegan LM and Finnegan, or LLMs in general and GANs in general, is GAN learns from very little data. About 8 words of English will be enough for it, whereas, LLMs now are trained on the entirety of the internet. So you get 2 very different models of language production in text and in speech, just like in humans, but also this is a computational models. And you know about the language models, that they are built on this statistical prediction, right, on tokenization. That's because all computational models require continuity. But here with text, the words are discrete. So tokens needed to be invented as a trick to circumvent this problem. The idea was really to cram as much data, as much information into the model as possible. So tokens can be whole parts, whole words, or just parts of words or punctuations, and they get combined together in this linear way, looking at both directions of the text, acting on probability. So these are LLMs. And this tokenization leads to what I call structural monolingualism, not just at the level of the output, which here you can see is aligned with the Anglophone culture of the Silicon Valley culture, more specifically, if you're using these models, but also at the inner level, where basically every single piece of data, be it a text or a pixel or a climate change data, is tokenized. It's all put into tokens, where it's then translated back when it comes out as an output into French, Japanese, or the Python code, but it all comes from the tokenization from that pool. That's why it's structurally monolingual. With GANs, it's a completely different production. We're dealing with raw audio. It's continuous already because, so there's no technical intervention needed because it's speech. Speech, language at phonetic level is continuous. So it goes from noise to a certain structure, which ends up being a word or multiple words that end up concatenating, that end up producing syntactic structures. And if I give you just a couple of examples, right? We saw Finnegan's Wake examples, we saw Finnegan LM examples. So again, we'll produce a plausible word like water or carrot or Andre or Nancy. It will also produce nonce words. So a word that could be a word, but we just haven't enlisted into our vocabulary. Sart, buldy, wargi, they're all plausible English words. We just don't use them, whereas gzfuk is not, right? It's not a word. So GAN doesn't do that. It knows it should not supposed to do that. And so we call this imagitation, because GAN needs to create from noise a structure purely based on the basis of the feedback from the inner network. This is all baked in production. It happens within the network. No human is involved. Imitation, right, is this property of it. It's generalizing, it's extrapolating underlying principles that you get in really trying to approximate what you're getting from the environment with your own devices, right? You're trying with that. And then imagitation pushes those regularities into novel combinations, into novel innovations, really. So this process exceeds mere imitation. It doesn't just iterate identical copies. It makes up new words all the time and further syntax. So this is the basis of how GANs operate. They constantly extrapolate. Now, why is this useful for Joyce studies? It brings another view to Joyce, a literary giant that's basically doing children's operations that we see in folklore art, that we see now in computation, and using this GAN-like it's also a bit out of spite because my advisor wrote 10, 20 years ago that who would have wanted to read another Joyce article if it's just, are we adding something to the language? And I think Joyce for computation is actually extremely interesting. You've probably seen the hypertext projects as well. So this is like rising up to the challenge a bit. But it's really about this GAN-like concatenation, imagitation that you can see Joyce doing, playing with this pre-verbal world where one knows some of the rules of the game and explores the rest. One does not know every word, right? There is to know, but one can imagitate. So this process that GANs do, that these neural networks do, is more biological than the one we see with LLMs, because it's more akin to how us humans acquire language. And Joyce's imagination produces meaning in a novel way, as all good literature does. But we have yet to discover what computational models really do with imagination, or what they can do. So for machine learning, for their community, this kind of work is important because it's not done in CS. This is really humanistic interpretability, this understanding of how machine learning works within. And you can see what holds this exteriority together, what the models can provide really depends on its interior, because what we call latent spaces, Hannes and I have a reading group on precisely that from the humanistic perspective, are these black boxes of the models that really work as epistemic frameworks of what the model can produce, of what the model can see or imagine. And we argue here that they are much more porous, penetrable than they might seem. Even through humanistic questioning, you can get to this. I mean, just think about poetry as this foundational form of exploring meaning in an unknown structure. These techniques can be applied to now computationally established structures that are, as we argue, explorable through language. I cannot really delve into the physicality of it, but you can take a look at the paper. Thank you all very much.
So thank you, Yair, for the invitation. Thank you, this Townsend Center, for the hospitality. It's a great conference with lots of resonances across speakers, especially in this panel. I keep taking notes that I can reference you. Let me maybe quickly just start with Worms. What you see here is a panel from Ernie Bushmiller's comic strip Nancy. Asked about his new job at a fishing store, the character Sluggo holds up a cup of bait and replies in his Bronx accent, "They pay me in Worms." Charming in its absurdity, the isolated panel circulated as a minor meme in 2022. The panel also prompted a curious blog post, later flagged by Blue Sky user Max Colvette. It reads like what we now call slop: low-quality AI-generated content optimized for search traffic rather than information of meaning. The post titled, "They Pay Me in Worms: The Truth About This Bizarre Form of Payment," is marked as slop not only because it is verbose and directionless, but also because it fails to perform the simple phonological normalization any competent speaker of English would make, namely recognizing that worms means worms. Instead, it treats it as a contextless floating signifier that urges the question, what is worms? After discussing several possibilities, maybe it's a Reddit in-joke, maybe a spoonerism of warm coins, though certainly a highly unusual form of currency, the post even offered, fittingly for this conference, an interpretation evoking reader response theory. As writer Umberto Eco discussed regarding poetic language, this ambiguity of meaning allows readers to contextualize worms based on their own experience and struggles with work, identity, and purpose. I will set aside the obvious question, is this a reading? To ask whether a large language model can read would commit me to either metaphorical language or stances about experience, intention, and consciousness. I prefer to bracket. Instead, I would like to focus on how we read LLM writing, or what I call here synthetic text. The Williams blog post is one such example, produced entirely or to a large extent through LLMs like Claude or ChatGPT. In 2023, synthetic writing still was a curiosity. Its artificiality was evident. With improved systems, this is no longer the case. And indeed, in my own tests with current models, all correctly understood that worms are worms. As synthetic text becomes more fluent, its origin grows opaque. Elsewhere, I have described this as the post-artificial condition. Once human-sounding text can be mass-produced by machine, we can no longer assume that a text we encounter is human-authored. For at least 2 centuries, that assumption structured our reading habits. This is beginning to change. Doubt now threatens to become a new standard. As a result, the hermeneutic behavior Eve Sedgwick has termed paranoid reading has turned into a mass phenomenon. What is interesting now is that literary scholars are but a part of this mass. For no matter our disciplinary training, we all equally participate in what one might call folk forensics, scanning an email, a post, a student essay, or a text message for telltale signs of machinic origin. Here's an example from a Reddit group, Is This AI?, where users collectively try to identify synthetic text. Despite this wholesale adoption of the hermeneutics of suspicion, the response in literary studies to the emergence of synthetic text has been relatively muted, and this conference is a rare exception. Little has been said about how to read synthetic text or what its emergence means methodologically and theoretically for our practices of reading and interpretation. It is almost as if the assumption of an infinite iterability allowed us to dispense with the question altogether. A text is a text is a text, no matter whence it came. At the same time, I have heard more than one once hardened Barthian insist they never want to read a novel not written by a human. It is safe to say that in the face of the post-artificial condition, some of our assumptions about what constitutes reading and the readable are under pressure. A more activist strand within the humanities has adopted a critical stance that shifts attention from the texts these systems produce to the models themselves in order to excavate their underlying structures. Critical AI studies has yielded essential analyses, mapping genealogies of power and knowledge, analyzing the epistemic and ontological assumptions embedded in AI development, exposing ecological and labor cost, and situating AI within colonial histories. This work is indispensable, and I'm teaching a grad seminar on this right now. Yet synthetic text here appears merely as a pathway towards depth, not as an object in its own right. The surface is treated as incidental. If we are concerned with contemporary reading practices, however, that surface warrants attention before being reduced to what supposedly lies beneath. After all, it is that surface that we encounter in the life world. What is missing, I would suggest, is a practice of surface reading synthetic text, borrowing the term from Sharon Marcus and Stephen Best, already invoked several times in this conference. It resists the assumption that depth and depth alone warrants analysis, and instead foregrounds the immediacy and manifest features of the text. Yet because text may now have a non-human source, its mode of production should at least heuristically inform our reading, not to reduce interpretation to them, but to refine our attention to that surface itself. That this task is anything but straightforward, I will argue in the remainder of this talk. I will make 3 points. First, that reading these surfaces indeed poses problems that conventional text or even other technical systems do not yet present or did not yet present. Second, that the character of the text thus produced nevertheless allows for humanistic approaches to what I call a probabilistic intuition via the venerable concept of style. Third, I will give 2 examples that approach but not quite fulfill the idea of a surface reading of LLMs. For the problem of the post-artificial remains. Nevertheless, this approach may help us to advance beyond the mere folk forensics we are engaged in at the moment. The hermeneutics of suspicion has emerged as a broad response to synthetic writing, differs in important ways from the paranoid reading Sedgwick described among her peers when confronting what we may now call non-synthetic text. Both approaches seek to move beyond the surface into some underlying depth, in one case to detect a machinic origin, on the other expose what the text expresses. Yet the object of this reading is structurally different in each case. The distinction can be outlined along 2 axes. First, in regard to how each treats its anomalies, and second, in regard to the fixity or dynamism of the text itself. In his work on cultural analytics, Lev Manovich considers what occurs when hermeneutic practices meet statistical methods. Echoing Dilthey's distinction between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft, natural sciences and humanities, he characterizes the former as oriented towards regularities and the latter towards singularities. Each treats anomalies differently. In statistics, the outlier is noise to be removed. In literary scholarship, the ambiguous passage, the crux interpretum, is precisely that which demands attention, a symptomatic thread that may unravel the fabric of the text as a whole. The problem with synthetic text now is that it is itself the result of a process that can only be described in scientific and statistical terms as the extraction of the general from the particular. LLMs smooth out exceptions, transforming individual utterances into statistical models of linguistic regularity. What hermeneutics would isolate as a telling deviation becomes, at the level of the model, a marginal signal absorbed in the mean. The symptom then loses its privilege. This connects directly to the second point. LLM outputs undermine textual fixity. They are neither singular nor static. In a polemic against a certain naivete with which humanists approach AI, Fabian Offert and Ranjit Singh Dhaliwal have observed that such critics often base a general judgment about a system on a single or very few outputs. Catching the model, as it were, red-handed in making factual mistakes, logical blunders, or ideological statements becomes a symptomatic reading practice that humanists feel comfortable with in the age of AI. Offert and Dhaliwal call this an n=1 reading. This strategy, they argue, is however fundamentally misaligned with the probabilistic nature of contemporary machine learning, whose outputs vary depending on prompts, contexts, and sampling parameters. To put it polemically, it is not enough to ask ChatGPT a question, riff on its output, and then call it a day. This is as if the fairness of a die could be judged from a single throw. We are used to the text as a relatively stable object, literally as a text on the page, or at best a text in which a few variants exist that may be captured in the stemma of textual criticism. Synthetic text, however, resists this fixity. It might even be wrong to speak of a text here at all, for what we are confronted with is intelligible only as one sample from a probability distribution of a manifold of possible texts. The first step towards a surface reading of LLMs, then, is to recognize that the object of interpretation has shifted, and that in a double sense. Not only is the text dynamic rather than stable, so that a reading practice that focuses on isolated deviations misrecognizes the phenomenon. What is more, the aim can no longer be to locate the singular thread that unravels it. This marks, and I here quote graduate students Francesco Fritz and Dana Karut, a move from an unrepresentative representative to a representative mode of reading. In classical symptomatic reading, the surface anomaly is unrepresentative in that it is an anomaly, but representative as a part of a depth structure once read against the grain. In synthetic text, by contrast, the anomaly is not structurally privileged, but merely a low probability event. What generally represents the textual system as a whole is its statistical typicality. Surface reading LLMs then starts with an attention to this regularity rather than to the exceptional case. This brings me back to my original question. Knowing this difference, how do we read synthetic text? I would say this. Just because looking at one sample is not enough does not mean that looking at samples is wrong. Just because the surface is variable does not mean that no surface is useful. And while one way forward, and the one favored by Offert and Dhaliwal, is to embrace empirical methods and benchmarks across many samples, we might call this an n=1000 methodology, I would like to make the case that this is not the only one, for literary scholarship already has a way of handling probability in its hermeneutical arsenal. We might begin by saying that simply recognizing the difference between synthetic and non-synthetic text already alters our interpretive stance. It protects us from what Gabriele de Seta calls algorithmic folklore, the tendency to explain opaque systems through user-spun myths. One example here would be shadow banning on social media, the unproven assumption that some users, unbeknownst to them, are muted by the algorithm. At the same time, this perspective enables what Willem Flusser calls a technical imagination. That is, the capacity to approach new media according to their own logic rather than through inherited models. A photograph should not be read like a painting, nor a digital image like a photograph. The same applies to synthetic text. In this sense, Flusser has an idea of depth in mind too, yet his phenomenological approach begins from the surface, since only the phenomenon can provide the intuition that abstract knowledge of the technical substrate cannot, knowledge that must nonetheless remain in view to ask the right questions. The challenge for humanistic inquiry into synthetic text today lies in the fact that we have not yet developed the requisite intuition, the technical imagination that brings what we experience in relative contact with how things work. What is required resembles maybe something like connoisseurship in art history, a trained sensitivity to patterned regularities that are neither strictly rule-bound nor arbitrary, and that is based on a sufficient knowledge of the techniques used. Like connoisseurship, however, such a practice needs to be practiced by reading many services from many systems in many contexts. In the end, such an interpretive and experimental engagement appears justifiable for me as developing something like a probabilistic intuition. And here, the idea of the regime of training, I think, becomes interesting again. This brings me to the second type of probabilistic engagement with text and the humanities. Cultivating intuition for systems, Cultivating an intuition for such systems by reading their surfaces amounts above all to apprehending the style of their outputs. If isolated samples output cannot yield immediate insight about the text that remains absent, a set of samples can, but only insofar as the set reveals a shared unity of complexity across its probabilistic variations that make them part of that set. This unity of complexity is what one might call style. Style, at least in this definition, is never just the property of a single thing, but always of a series. It is a probabilistic surface feature that is shared across all elements of that series without being identical with them. In that sense, style, as Jeff Dolvin writes, quote, holds things together. It makes us see wholes where we might be bewildered by parts. This aligns well with Best and Marcus's definition of, quote, surfaces as the location of patterns that exist within and across texts. Style is this across. The repetition and difference that oversamples signals a collective unity as a single apprehensible appearance. All of this does not mean that a single ML model is not capable of producing different styles, which of course it is. But it means that given similar initial conditions, sampled outputs will share a particular style. Here, I believe one can argue for a praxis of honing a technical imagination that offers a surface-level complement to empirical methods, which it does not replace but possibly augment. Rather than treating outputs as fixed representations or singular texts, we can learn to perceive them as moments in a broader probabilistic field that becomes unified in its production of a shared systemic Gestalt, as we might say. And we can read it off from the surface once we have an understanding of some of its technical background. What might a praxis look like that cultivates probabilistic intuition by attending to style as a genuine surface rather than an epiphenomenon of depth? I cannot claim that I have a good answer for this. This is where this talk is presenting an open-ended question rather than defending results. But I can essay two examples that at least gesture in the direction of the type of reading I imagine and that bring the experience of reading together with an awareness of the underlying system. Returning to the case of Worms from the beginning, we might sense a quality of the writing we could call referential drift. The central term Worms slips free from its anchoring reference and begins to float, generating interpretive possibilities that never fully resolve. Instead of semantic clarification, the text offers meta-commentary on meaning, staging a performance of knowledge that conceals an epistemic void. This is not simple unmarked incoherence, but a historically specific style of slop that might already be no longer the case. A surface reading would track how this drift manifests phenomenologically, how indeterminacy is managed through sham contextualization, use of seemingly precise examples, and strategic citation, moving towards fluent but non-committal abstraction. Formulaic generalities, in today's fast-paced world, as many have argued, this raises important questions, etc., compound this impression. The result is a distinct economy of vagueness visible at the level of style. Such a reading would also connect this phenomenal surface to dimensions of depth, without, however, privileging one as the only that should count. Following Flusser's principle that technical imagination requires knowledge of the theories on which apparatuses are based, we can approach this phenomenon through several possibilities, again, none privileged over the others. One explanatory frame does concern model architecture. The drift of worms can be traced to the operations of tokenization and embeddings. Text is, as Nina already explained, first split into subword units, tokens, which can be a word or less. It is then, second, mapped to vectors whose meaning derives from distributional relations to other words in the model. Right? This is structuralism at work. While worms exists as one stable token, worms is decomposed into known fragments, as you see here, yielding a representation that is contextually shaped but semantically underdetermined. Faced with this instability, the model defaults to this generic discourse on ambiguity rather than performing a pragmatic correction a human reader would apply. Yet this technical account is only one lens. A political economic reading situates worms within the logic of content farms and SEO, or search engine optimization, where verbosity serves visibility and monetization. Long before AI, human-produced slop operated similarly. Here, the increase of text is both technical artifact and economic strategy. More text generates more traffic. Worms thus becomes emblematic of slop itself, an ungrounded token endlessly elaborated for profit. Technical and economic perspectives alike illuminate the phenomenon, but neither is foundational. Each follows from a prior description of the surface, which remains the primary data. Or so it seems. In fact, worms is but fragile evidence for either a technical or an economic account, for all we have is the post. We do not know which model produced it, how it was prompted, or to what extent it was edited. In fact, even the original post is no longer available, only an updated version that is curiously not less coherent. Our suspicion that this is synthetic rests largely on already stylistic recognition, on its appearance as slop, and thus already on a certain intuition we have gained elsewhere in the wild. Thus, we return to the crux of the post-artificial condition, under which it is difficult to cultivate a professional probabilistic intuition without the secure knowledge of the underlying system. To address this limitation, and I come to an end, I turn to a second example in which the surface remains intact while the model's depth is at least partially accessible, because verum ipsum factum, I made the text myself. It also shows how arguments drawn exclusively from depth can overlook the phenomenon at hand. Angus Fletcher, for example, claims that any statistical machine learning system is in principle unable to narrate because narration is dependent on structures of causality. Causality cannot be properly reproduced via statistical correlations, therefore LLMs cannot narrate. We can bracket whether this is a correct description of narration for the moment. This is an argument from depth too, in that Fletcher makes his case based on first principles drawn from the technical structure of statistical machine learning. A surface reading of synthetic text might complicate that syllogism by attending to how narrativity manifests phenomenologically without presupposing some kind of incapacity. To make this case, I can draw on my dual identity as both a scholar and an author of digital writing by pointing to a novel I wrote with an LLM. This is, I'm aware, not an experiment in any empirically reliable sense, but artistic research. And yet it is in keeping with my argument that the approach to developing probabilistic intuition and exploring the gestalt features of LLM outputs can be done engaging experientially. The result of this praxis was the novel Berlin, Miami, that appeared in German in 2023 and will come out in translation by a human next year with MIT. And here again, translation as a specific kind of close reading raises all kinds of interesting questions. I made the book using an open LLM, GPT-J, fine-tuned on 4 German language novels. The output text is difficult to summarize precisely because it struggles with narrativity. At first glance, it seems to possess the elements of a conventional story, recurring characters, such as the mysterious Odradek-like Jawling, unfolding events such as Miami's succumbing to the sinister life viruses, snippets of dialogue, and even formal elements like chapter breaks or transitional passages. Yet a closer look reveals an odd anti-narrative quality of logical inconsistencies and temporal leaps. Events happen, but their connections are tenuous, even contradictory. Characters appear and reappear, yet their motivations remain opaque. One can now try to analyze the style of narration based purely on the surface of the text as a linguistic artifact, as a collective pattern across many samples. However, this means foregoing categories such as correlation and causation, which belong to a depth-oriented explanation, in favor of those of coherence and cohesion, who are much more about how the text appears at the surface. Nina mentioned it already. If cohesion names the linkage of textual elements at the phonological, orthographic, and lexicogrammatical level, coherence refers to their abstract semantic context. The distinction is ideal. Typical cohesion conveys coherence, and coherence enables cohesion to signify. Between the poles of pure material cohesion and pure ideal coherence, and beyond the unmarked text that balance both, lies a type of writing in which coherence is staged at the level of cohesion, and that is narrative. Here, coherence becomes the organizing principle condensed in chains of therefore that structure events across space and time. Berlin-Miami suspends both the conventional balance of cohesion and coherence and the elevation of coherence into a governing narrative logic. It exhibits an excess of cohesion, smooth transitions, recurring motifs, local fluency, without the sustained production of coherence. What emerges is a simulation of narrative patterning that never converges into a continuous structure. And this is from an existing publication, you can see that. From here, one may, of course, again go on connecting this to the underlying technical system, trying to explain it with the lack of causal reasoning or any other property of machine learning. At the same time, such a reading, because it starts from the surface of its object, will not be satisfied with this precipitous transition to a depth structure. For while the lack of coherence reduces the conventional narrative qualities of the text, such a reading would also acknowledge that the text is not non-narrative either. Rather, against Fletcher, narrativity emerges through the reader's act of sense-making, coming back to Eco, the experience-based practice that fills in indeterminacies, even if the text is non-human. Yet this very construction of the text on the part of the reader is always a function of what range of possible expectation a text allows for. And this is a question of experience with that type of text and its tendency, its technology of production, right? Think of Ong here. In other words, it is this process of convergence between the expected conventional and the realized actual form of the text, where the development of a probabilistic intuition might take place. And it does so within the confines of the new standard expectation that the post-artificial condition imposes on us, one to be sure that is trained, in this case, only on this text, as samples from this model with this training set, but an intuition nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much. I bet there are many questions out there, so let's get going. Who wants to go first?
Thank you all. This was wonderful. I had a question for Hannes about the sort of representation sort of model that you were describing and the question of method, which was that in some ways the crisis that is being described feels like it's a crisis in literary interpretation, understandably, but also the method you're describing feels like it resonates with methods in, like historical methods in media studies, which is to say that there's a kind of the medium is the message is maybe the answer to how to analyze literary works that sort of in an information theory sort of way evacuate themselves of interpretable meaning, where the meaning is precisely that this is a machine generated text. And so how do we sort of derive? So I wonder, I'm interested maybe in how the question of method outside of the literary, or whether the kind of parasitic function that media studies tends to serve in the way that people like Klaus Piess have described it, might be useful as a kind of parallel model, but also maybe how we distinguish it from these sort of literary styles, particularly when the question of whether or not something is a machine-generated text seems to be the site of crisis, in addition to what to do once we find that out in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. No, the crisis is the very problem, right? The crisis of identifiability, in a way. And while a media studies perspective that focus on the mediality of what is at issue here is helpful, I think what is very often missing, or maybe in a certain tradition of German media studies underdeveloped, is really what I would call a phenomenological perspective. Right, the idea, what is it like to read this, to be confronted with this, because that is exactly the position in which we find ourselves in what I call post-artificial. So maybe how this deviates from that tradition is that this is a praxis. It is an embodied knowledge. It is about the phenomenon that we see, But it cannot only be the phenomenon, because knowing how it was produced changes kind of the interpretive stance. And in this text, I go back and forth, obviously, between how much we can know, right? If we know, we are able to see through the text to some kind of underlying mechanism. But if we don't, we have to rely on kind of the arsenal of experience that we have built up. And what I find interesting is that we are all together in this kind of collective learning experience, how to deal with these surfaces. And my question is, how can we as textual scholars kind of bring our training and our special knowledge to that might put us in a better situation than everybody else? And gesturing towards style here as a way of dealing with probability distributions that we already have might be an easy answer to this, but it's gonna the first stab at that.
Thank you all. I was really struck by the resonances between the Finnegan's Wake paper and Hannes's paper, so in terms of also how these texts maybe function and operate, the the novels, right? And I'm wondering, so about, if we think of reading as a way of making sense, right? So, I mean, these texts are basically unsettling that. Joyce does it, and, the Miami novel also. So then, sort of, is there what, if it is not, or if it is about exposing nonsense, or, sort of inviting us to read the text as nonsense. So what happens to reading pleasure? Is there pleasure in this, in indulging in nonsense? We could go back all the way to Lewis Carroll, and there is also a literary tradition of celebrating nonsense. So is that one lens we can adopt when we are dealing with these texts and their processing?
There's a lot one could say about this. It's enjoyable. At least the writing is enjoyable. I don't know if the reading is enjoyable, but maybe one way to answer this is that, of course, nonsense is in itself not a mark of the machinic. Quite the opposite, right? If we have texts that are produced today with current language models, they are actually quite difficult to be nonsensical because they are in a way too good. And too good means already they went through a process of reinforcement learning through human feedback, where basically the possibility of outputs is narrowed to the most likely and the one we expect, a certain customer service language, et cetera, et cetera. What I find interesting here is that why nonsense becomes something that makes it, going back to the question of outliers, nonsense, once you know it is machinic texts, produces a different hermeneutic situation than if you're confronted with nonsense in Joyce, right? Obviously, Joyce asks you a question when you think this is nonsensical. It is a kind of a motivation for interpretation here. This is not obviously the case when you read a novel of which you know that it was produced by a machine. Now, if you think what I call the post-artificial all the way through the end, you can no longer tell the difference between those two. You have to adjust, once again, your reading practice to dispensing with the question of origin. That means you're kind of forced to read everything like a Joyce text. That is, as something that needs to be interpreted, because you don't have the permission anymore to just dismiss it by virtue of it having a machinic origin. And I think this is interesting. I wonder where this leads us, maybe to some kind of Barthian position, where the text has to forget its origin in order to be legible at all. Right? And I think there nonsense kind of loses the distinction between something that needs to be interpreted and something that can be dismissed as noise. Maybe very quickly add to that, obviously the machine didn't write it, right? I wrote it. I used a tool. I mean, the whole talk about the machine actually doing the writing is a shorthand because it needs someone to put it together in the end.
So my question follows immediately on the conversation that you're already having, and maybe directed a little bit more to Hannes, but also to the panel on the whole, especially picking up on the kind of ethos of the end of Matt's paper, which is I'm left wondering, and this is a real question. I mean, once we get past the forensic question of reading synthetic text, if you want to call it, or whatever it is that LLMs produce, which the forensic question is like a real one that teachers and editors have to confront all the time. But if that's not the issue, and I agree that that's a kind of local, tractable issue, if the real problem that we're interested in here is how do we take humanistic reading practice to a kind of machine produced product, my question really is like a kind of fundamental one, which is why. I mean, it seems to me at least like a category mistake. Like, why would we take a humanistic perspective to like a jet propulsion engine or a cyclotron, or to get closer to AI, perhaps to like, a bomb drone, which is exquisitely a drone that can, assassinate someone with exquisite accuracy, like, 4,000 miles from here, made, of course, by the exact same people who are also making LLMs, using fundamentally similar technology. But apart from the fact that the text has the same observable shape as human-produced writing, which I agree that it does, the question of why, I think, is a really like deep one, that goes all the way back to really the questions this conference started with, which is like, what is close reading? What is its institutional situation? What is its engagement with students, and with the creation of knowledge?
Thank you so much for such wonderful papers. My question is for Professor David Bates, but also I feel like it's relevant for a lot of the topics mentioned. I'm really interested in the concept of temporality of writing that kind of like coming up in your paper, and I'm thinking about Stiegler, how like Stiegler from the technology of alphabetic writing comes up with the concept of rereading as a temporal process that's more about like stretching across time, and with the differential identity that he kind of conceptualizes as this like that's like difference as stands between noetic bodies. That's something that's like contained, but travels in between bodies in terms of thinking and meaning making. So I'm just like broadly interested in what might be a temporality of rereading mediated by technical milieu and related to the question of re-individuation, and also with the proletarization, this like collective loss of knowledge that we're currently in crisis of, this production of disaffected individuals, what might be a spatiality and temporality of noetic bodies and noesis in general.
Thanks. This is a question sort of for the whole panel or whoever wants to take it up. I feel like there's been, I guess, a sort of specter in a lot of the different papers, like thinking about memory and thinking about, the book as object, the Finnegan's Wake as like an oral experience, and then also worms and worms and like what's going on there, like just the oral literature and like literature as sound, and thinking about like how right now, AI is now able to speak, and it's composing things that are going to be spoken by the robot voice. And I guess I wanted to invite kind of comments on how maybe thinking about listening as a reading practice, or is it like a reading practice? Is it a close reading practice? Could it be? And like what maybe AI can push us to think more about sound and orality as part of, kind of the literary questions we're asking about reading here.
Yeah, so just on this particular point, it's interesting to the humanities, the kind of romance with the machine, right? That no longer has the kind of aggressive, implications to have for humans. So maybe there is something, yes. machine-like in some ways in production of text. However, the questions that come in the very beginning of the say like consciousness, intentionality, but also like alive, right? And the world, machines don't have that. Never will. They have no founding for that. You know, I'd smash 1,000 they would like in a single page. Like in that way, the humans as that create writing is kind of a loose metaphor that doesn't the question of synthetic text.
Maybe I can very quickly add my perspective to that. I think the answer why, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's true to say that technical objects cannot be read through a humanistic lens. I mean, that is obviously not correct. Even the drone, the explanation of how it works doesn't give you an understanding how it is part of a culture of war, etc. Right? The point that I would, or the way that I would answer the why is first, it's pragmatic. There is it has an orienting function. That orienting function is simply motivated by the text, by the fact that we are surrounded by these texts, right? So how to deal with these? Ignore them? Maybe not, right? Maybe we have to at least confront it somewhat. Doesn't mean, by the way, I have at no point talked about literature as such, right? The Williams case, obviously, the blog post is not a literary text, and whether the novel fits the standard notion of literature is a different question. I would kind of keep it away from the genre description and first just look at what this text does to us when we experience it. A second answer for me would be a poetological one, at least as an author. I am very much interested in all kinds of techniques of experimental writing. And it's very easy to put this in a lineage, as you mentioned, that has an interest in what process of randomization, process of non-conscious writing, etc. do. In that sense, it's nothing new. Whether there is an inherent progressivism to either of those, I'm not sure. I mean, Marinetti was certainly very much interested in technology. I don't know if I would call him a progressive. And finally, for us, really, if we want to talk about literature, no one can prove to you that a book, a novel that came out in the last 3 years does not have AI text in it, right? There might be some kind of unwritten contract with writers that they won't use this if they, think of themselves as proper writers, but there is no way to prove this. So we have at least to, entertain the idea that we already, in our reading practice as literary scholars, engage with such texts.